And I am working as a senior consultant in. Everybody understands here English, isn't it? That will be the mode, isn't it?
Yes, yes, yes.
So I'm Dr. Megha. I'm working as a senior consultant in Max Hospital here in Delhi NCR region as a pain and palliative care physician. And thank you so much, Pallium, and for inviting me for this lecture. And I really, really apologize for being late for this. Thank you so much, Shri. So I think without wasting any further time, we'll just discuss a little bit about delirium, which is a really, everybody I'm supposing is general practitioner, doctor, or any other doctors who are not palliative care physicians, right?
Yes, yes. We have almost all the specialty doctors here.
So yeah, so delirium overall, is majorly managed by, the psychiatrists or neurologists who are actually the masters of delirium, I would say. However, we in palliative medicine also deal with a lot of patients who have delirium and which can be secondary to certain causes, and we will see how as the slides unfold. Right, so this is delirium, and it is derived from a Latin word which means delirare, to go out of the furrow or off the track. That means the patient, sometimes we also call that, that the patients are in altered sensorium, or they are in psychosis. So many times this is kind of misdiagnosed with those things. Right? There can be many scenarios when the patients are in delirium. Say, I've just given in a little background about a few of the cases, how we can find this. So a 55-year-old male who is a chronic alcoholic and liver failure, who's admitted with hematemesis. In the ward, he shouts, abuses, becomes restless, pulls out the IV lines. So somebody of that sort. Then an 80-year-old man with prostatomegaly who develops fever and rigor, talks irrelevantly, not able to recognize the relatives, is disoriented to place and time. Or a 60-year-old lady, known diabetic, on insulin, found in a state of lethargy. 40-year-old lady with CA breast, had surgery, chemo. On one fine morning, she was found in a state of disorientation, and says that there are a lot of lions in the room who are staring at her. So it is overall a neuropsychiatric symptom, as I said. So neurologists and psychiatrists are the best persons actually to diagnose, this delirium, right? So delirium is characterized by an acute change in cognition, right? So and a disturbance in consciousness, usually resulting from an underlying medical condition or from a medication or drug withdrawal. Right. So, so basically, when we are all awake, or yeah. So the state of consciousness or cognition is defined by, as I recently heard someone talking about delirium. So we usually, divide consciousness into three things. That one is alertness. Another, when one is awakeness, then alertness, and then that when we are actually thinking. I was also there. Shri, can you remind me of three things? Alert. One is awakeness, the state of awakeness, the state of alertness, and another state of. Okay, we'll come to it. I think in upcoming slides. Yeah. Okay. So, so basically, delirium is characterized by an acute change in cognition and a disturbance of consciousness, which is usually resulting from an underlying medical condition. So, it is very important whenever we are dealing with delirium to find the secondary causes to it, right? Underlying medical condition, or there can be some medications or drug withdrawal that can lead to delirium. So cognition is the internal structures and processes that are involved in the acquisition and use of knowledge, including sensation, perception, attention, learning, memory, language, thinking, and reasoning. So this is all cognition, you know. So and next, when we talk about it, approximately why is it important when we are all learning about palliative medicine? Why is it important for us to know about delirium is that 80% of cancer patients have delirium near death. And delirium is an indicator of poor prognosis and end of life. It means that the patients are nearing end of life. I think it is also the part of palliative prognostic index. So is it only in the cancer patients? No. 10 to 20% of all the hospitalized adults, 30 to 40% of elderly hospitalized patients, and 80% of the ICU patients. Okay, so not just in cancer patients. So in many we all know the thing that ICU psychosis. So they are in ICU, all the elderly patients. These are some of the predisposing factors for delirium. There are also certain diagnostic criteria for delirium, which is by Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-4-TR. And the diagnostic criteria includes disturbance of consciousness, of course, which is the reduced clarity of awareness of the environment, that the patient is not really clear, as we say, the patient is disoriented to the present situation where he is, right? With reduced ability to focus and sustain or shift attention. So first was when we, disturbance of consciousness, right? Second is change in cognition. Cognition as in memory, language disturbance, perceptual disturbance, that the patient is not able to perceive the things as they are. And that is not better accounted for by a pre-existing, established or evolving dementia. Yeah, of course, dementia is one of the very important differential diagnoses for delirium. The disturbance develops over a short period of time, usually hours to days, and tends to fluctuate during the course of the day. As we all, those who are practicing physicians, we all know that patients, they tend to say that by the evening, I start to, the patients start becoming more disoriented, or evenings are not very comfortable. They ghabrahat, the feeling of ghabrahat that happens in the evenings till early mornings, and then the patient sleeps better through the day. Just in case anybody has any concerns in between, you can just interrupt me and ask any questions or anything, okay? Then evidence from the history, physical examination, or laboratory findings that indicate that the disturbance is caused by a direct physiologic consequence of a general medical condition. So this is part of diagnostic criteria of delirium. Acute confusion. Now let us talk about acute confusion state, right? So this is like mental clouding, and the patient is not very clear as to, at one point of time, the patient is talking logical and thoughtful, while at the other time, the patient is not really very clear, poor concentration, impairment of short-term memory, and disorientation. Misinterpretation, paranoid delusions, as I also mentioned in one of the patients that I mentioned earlier, or hallucinations, agitation, incoherent speech, and aggressive behavior. That's acute confusional state. So the delirium, how does the delirium present? Delirium usually presents either as a hyperactive or hypoactive, okay? So hyperactive when the patients, and sometimes it can be fluctuating or both, okay, mixed delirium. So in hyperactive delirium, the patients present with psychomotor agitation, increased arousal, and delusions. The degree of cognitive impairment may be variable and even minimal. Then there is hypoactive delirium. The features of this type of delirium include withdrawal, lethargy, and reduced arousal. or mixed delirium. Presentation with features of both hyperactive and hypoactive is not unusual. This commonly happens. And mostly the patients are initially hyperactive and then they go into hypoactive delirium. So delirium often is unrecognized or misdiagnosed and is mistaken for dementia, depression, and mania, includes schizophrenic reaction or a part of old age. Okay, so this slide is really important because many times in our clinical practice, we say that the patient is old, they just happen to think like that. So it is very important to diagnose what delirium is and to diagnose it early. It is very important not to diagnose. There are also stages of delirium, okay? So initially the patient is just on and off confused. And if we pick that up at that stage, it is the easiest for us to manage it. However, if the patient has gone to an aggressive behavior or finally into the stage of coma, that stage, of course, is more difficult to handle. So we need to, when we know about delirium, then only we'll diagnose it. And to always rule out the underlying dementia. Patients who have underlying dementia or underlying depression, these are the predisposing factors for delirium, okay? So we need to differentiate dementia, depression, mania, acute schizophrenic reaction, or just a part of old age. We need to, these are the major DDs also, and where we mistake delirium for these things, right? We need to be aware of these things. So what are the, how will we distinguish between all these? Delirium, dementia, psychotic disorders, and depression. So delirium is fluctuating level of consciousness with decreased attention and disorientation, visual hallucinations, agitation, apathy, withdrawal, impairment in memory and attention. And this is mostly acute onset, and in most cases remits with correction of underlying medical condition. It is very important. Delirium mostly has an underlying medical condition, either electrolyte disturbances or some medications like amitriptyline and those things. These are very commonly associated with delirium when they are being used in higher doses. So we need to know the underlying medical condition. However, in dementia, the major thing is a memory impairment, right? The patient forgets, and disorientation, agitation happens because we are not able to connect to the patient. We are not able to provide that appropriate care that the patient has forgotten. And now we need to talk to the patients like that, right? So disorientation and agitation also happens in dementia, but the major thing is memory impairment. And it is always chronic and slow onset and progressive. However, the delirium is acute onset. And depression, majorly sadness, loss of interest, and anhedonia, as we call it, or pleasure, the loss of interest in the usual pleasurable activities. This the hypoactive delirium sometimes is confused with depression, but then that's more depression. In depression, mostly there's a past history, and the patients may not be hypoactive, right? And of course, we need to see the underlying causes. Then there are, of course, disturbance of sleep, appetite, concentration, and energy, and the feeling of hopelessness. So anhedonia, feeling of hopelessness and worthlessness, suicidal tendencies, and single or recurrent episodes, and it can be chronic. So these are anhedonia, feeling of hopelessness, worthlessness, talking about suicides. So these are the major characteristic things about depression, and which help us to differentiate delirium from depression. Then psychotic disorders, there is deficit in reality testing, usually slow onset with prodrome, and they are chronic with in between exacerbations. So of course, to diagnose all these things, we do need a psychiatrist, and along with a neurologist. We work in tandem with them whenever we are dealing with such cases. So, okay, why is delirium important for all of us to know, right? When we are talking about palliative medicine, it is really important for all of us to know delirium, because it has direct implications on the patient, on the family, and on the staff. Of course, the patient is affected, isn't it? There is interference in communication, the time is lost, increased investigations. Yeah, when the patient is delirious, we do order some blood tests and scans, and increase interventions like IV line, opioid changes, sedation, and all those things. You know? So this prevents patients' participations in treatment decisions. So we need to know that when there is delirium, as I already said, that delirium is kind of an indicator for towards end of life. There are higher chances. So it also prevents patients' participation in treatment decisions, and we also tend to do more interventions when the patient has delirium. It's important for the patient. It also makes the assessment of other symptoms more difficult. We are many times not able to be sure if the patient has pain, if the pain is causing the patient to be hyperactive, or the hyperactive behavior is causing looks like that the patient is in pain because of the hyperactive behavior, right? So it's important for us to assess it in both the ways. Interferes with communication between the patients and their family. Families find changes in their relatives' mental state one of the most distressing parts of the caregiving, isn't it? The person that they knew does not now exist towards the end of their life, and the person they knew has changed altogether. He or she is behaving abnormally. So this is really distressing for the caregivers. Difficulty in interpreting symptoms, as I said, and there is also conflict with relatives, and there is increased stress overall. So some of the causes, we always need to know the causes of the secondary causes of delirium. As simple as fecal impaction can cause the patient to become delirious. Of course, pain can cause the patient to become delirious. Urinary retention can cause infections, dehydration, brain tumors. Very important thing is to rule out electrolyte disturbances, because all these patients have poor oral intake, so they are at high risk of developing electrolyte disturbances like hypercalcemia, hyponatremia. And of course, very important, as I already mentioned, opioids, corticosteroids, anticholinergics, all these drugs, our patients invariably are on opioids and anticholinergics like amitriptyline, nortriptyline, and steroids, and all these drugs can lead to delirium. Of course, some chemotherapeutic agents like cisplatin, 5-FU, and methotrexate, they also lead to that. And withdrawal state, so the patients who have history of alcohol intake and nicotine and psychotropic drugs, when these drugs are withdrawn, that can lead to delirium and thiamine deficiency. So these are the predisposing factors. And what are the precipitating factors? And a change of environment. Suddenly when the patient, so there's kind of a rule that less than 2% of the patients develop delirium at home. 30% of the patients develop delirium in the hospital settings, and more than 60% develop it in ICU settings. So the more different the environment is that the patient is used to, there are higher chances that the patient will become delirious. So change of environment, unfamiliar stimuli, like anybody who's coming and pricking the patient to take the samples and not telling the patient what they are exactly about to do. So unfamiliar stimuli, too hot, too cold, the bed is wet, there are creases in the sheets. So this is so important for little things. These are the things that we take care in palliative care, isn't it? That the patient should be at home, that we always tell the patient what we are going to do, taking care of a comfortable environment for the patient, changing the sheet, changing the diapers. So all these things are really important. And delirium is frequently underdiagnosed, of course, because we do not formally screen for it. So there are many ways, there are some objective tools to diagnose and screen the patients for delirium. One of that is Mini-Mental Status Examination, Memorial MDAS, Memorial Delirium Assessment Scale. I'll just go through, not in great details, but a little bit about these. Mini-Mental State Examination. So, there are a total of 30 scores, and we need to know about time orientation, place orientation, registration of 3 words, attention, calculation, recall of 3 words. So these are certain things. So Mini-Mental Scale Examination, I'm sure we all have heard about it, but we do not really memorize it by heart. But this is important. Then Memorial Delirium Assessment Scale, MDAS. Right. So here there are a few items that we see. I'll just go through it in a little bit. So item 1 is reduced level of consciousness or awareness. Right. Rate the patient's current awareness of awareness of an interaction with the environment, like interviewer, other objects or people in the room. And so you can kind of ask the patient, describe your surroundings. Okay. So if the patient is able to do that, so all these items are scaled on a scale of 0, 1, 2, 3, mild, moderate, and severe. None is that patient is fully aware. Mild is that patient is unaware of some elements. However, they are able to tell a little bit. Moderate, patient is unaware of some or all the elements in the environment and not spontaneously interacting with the interviewer, and becomes incompletely aware or inappropriately interactive when prodded strongly, right? And then there is severe impairment. Severe impairment of consciousness. So this is how we can do it. Then item 2 is disorientation. First is awareness, second is disorientation. So there are 10 orientation items. Date, month, you can ask the patient about the date. What date is it? What month is it? Day, year, season, floor, name of the hospital, city. Isn't it? We usually ask this in our general examination also. Again, we do it as 0, 1, 2, 3. Then the third item is short-term memory impairment, repetition and delayed recall of 3 words. In that, immediately repeat and recall words 5 minutes later. Right? You tell the patient any 3 words, say anything like guitar, clock, and computer. Right? So ask the patient to repeat them immediately, and then after 5 minutes, get back to that. Right? So again, 0, 1, 2, 3. Right? Item 4 is impaired digit span. To repeat 3, 4, then 5 digits forwards. So it's like that, So basically, we are just trying to assess what is the present level of consciousness and alertness of the patient. Again, 0, 1, 2, 3. Reduced ability to maintain and shift attention when we are assessing the attention. That's item 5. PK questions need to be rephrased, repeated. This, I'm sure this presentation can be shared with all of you guys. Dr. Sri can do that, and you can go through all these in more details. All these items are graded as 0, 1, 2, 3. Disorganized thinking, rambling, irrelevant or incoherent speech, tangential, circumstantial, or faulty reasoning. So you can just tell the patients to describe their own current medical condition. Again, 0, 1, 2, 3. 0 is when the patient is normal, and 3 is when that thing is severely impaired. Perceptual disturbances and delusions, inappropriate behavior during the interview. We can always, while the interview, we will know about it. If the patient has delusions, we will definitely know about it. And decreased or increased psychomotor activity, that will tell us about hypoactive, hyperactive, or the elements of both are present or not. Again, 0, 1, 2, 3. And sleep-wake cycle, again, with the help of the caregivers and the nurses, we will get to know about the sleep-wake cycle. And observations from the previous night or morning evaluations only. So it is important, we always ask the patient, how was your night? Could you sleep? So this is important because mostly the patients, they are not able to sleep during the night, and then they fall asleep early in the morning. So total, there is a score that comes out as a total of 30, isn't it? Total of 10 items and maximum 0, 1, 2, 3. So total score is 30. And 13 out of 30 is the cutoff point, right? How to do it? So in short, how do we do it? Orientation to time, place, and person, short-term memory, digit span, hallucinations and delusions, and illusions and delusions, and hypo or hyperactive, and sleep. And observe the level of simultaneously while you're doing this, observe the level of consciousness, disorganized thinking, and focus, sustain or shift attention. So important. Now that we know that it is important. Second, we know that we need to differentiate it from other causes. And now that we have, we start screening for it, and we start to say how much that it exists, right? So now we need to manage it. Correct the correctable, very, very important. Many times, we in palliative, while we are learning palliative care, we think that it is okay that the patient is like that. If the patient is imminently dying, we may not be able to correct the correctable too. Sometimes if the patient is imminently dying. However, it is very important for us to correct the correctable, do the non-drug treatment and the drug treatment. Many times as physicians, I have seen people that the patient is in delirium, okay, haloperidol, 2 milligram HS or 2 milligram BD. So those things. So, but it's important to find the cause. Non-drug treatment is so important, right? All our nurses know how to do it. They write down, but they actually don't do it, right? And of course, the drug treatment. So we already discussed about the causes, fecal impaction, rule out. So these are the basic things, which we do in our regular symptom assessment. So constipation, pain, has the patient passed urine, how many times, any fever, then assess for dehydration. And of course, if we know what we are dealing with, the underlying disease. So if we think that there is a metastasis, a new metastasis to the brain, we need to find out the cause and treat accordingly. And hypercalcemia, hyponatremia, sending a blood panel is again important. Then reviewing the drugs is so important. Many times I have myself received consults for the pain, and the patient was actually on higher doses of opioids than required. That was causing him to be, there are neurotoxicities of the opioids that causes the patient to become hyperactive, and the physicians think that the patient is in pain. So actually we need to reduce the opioids at that time and find it, and we know that the patient might become a little better. And of course, other causes need to be taken into consideration. Then if the patient has recently received cisplatin, 5-FU, methotrexate, all these causes, and withdrawal states. Non-drug management. I feel in delirium, as a palliative care physician, I feel non-drug management is so important. We can never underestimate its importance. Tell the patient and the family that the delirium is not madness. So many caregivers, they feel that they are towards the end of life, and we feel that they are going mad. So tell them it's not madness. Continue to treat the patient with courtesy and respect. And involve them in the decision making. Ask them, tell them that we are going to take a blood sample. You will feel a little prick. So you will see that the patients do respond better when we are talking to them. And of course, no restraints. I'm sure everybody, there are 60 participants here. So everybody has seen patients in ICU restraint, physical restraint. So please, no physical restraints. If we feel that the patient can harm themselves or can harm others, so we need to do some chemical restraining if at all, but no physical restraints ever. Patient should be allowed to walk, but of course accompanied. explain every event and every procedure that we are going to do. Presence of a family member is so important in, say, if we need to, if there's a patient of brain metastasis and the patient needs to undergo an intrathecal methotrexate injection. So in that case, mostly the doctors will send the caregivers outside. So a patient who is delirious, presence of a family member holding hand at that time is so important, and this just decreases our on our drug usage so much. Doctors can acknowledge the patient's distress. I can see that you're very upset, acknowledging that the patients are upset, that they are going through a rough patch. So it's really important, and it goes in a long way, maintaining a rapport with the patient and with the caregivers. Understand, the caregivers also appreciate a lot when we understand their patients. Environmental modifications, orientation protocol is so important. We in our hospital, we keep taking classes for our nurses, especially ICU nurses, for orientation protocols. Whenever the nurses are in and out with the patients all the time, especially in the ICU. So always greeting the patient whenever they are putting an IV line also. So tell the patient, we teach the patients to tell, the nurses should tell the patients, okay, this is 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm just giving you this medicine. This medicine will help you in the pain. While they are doing it, they do not need to, take out separate time for that. But this is very important. And putting a clock in front of the patient, keeping the bedside of the patient towards the sun, so that they know that it is daytime. And while there is dusk, so dimming the lights off. So all these things, putting a calendar, family photos. So orientation protocols, these are very important, and nurses play a huge role in that. We as doctors are not able to be there with the patient all the time. So nurses, whenever they're in and out with the patient, telling them their name, like, I am Nurse Megha, and I will be taking care of you for 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. So this just tells the patient, okay, this is afternoon, she's giving me this medication, she's giving me this food. So orientation protocol, very, very important for this. Environment should be stable, quiet, well lighted, support from a familiar nurse. Many patients, they become very comfortable with one nurse when they are frequently visiting the hospital or a hospice. So this a familiar nurse may be assigned for them, and presence of family should be encouraged. Family members and staff should explain the proceedings, and at every opportunity reinforce orientation and assure the patient, as I already said. Sensory deficits should be corrected. Like if the patient uses an eyeglasses or hearing aids, they should always be there with the patient. They need it. And of course, drug treatments, haloperidol is there. We can use it 1.5 to 3 milligram every 8 hourly. And 1 milligram, it can be given subcutaneous or IV, or as continuous infusion also we use sometimes haloperidol when towards end of life care. Then risperidone is there. Haloperidol, we need to be careful. It causes QT prolongation. And risperidone. Then we also have quetiapine, which is more safer, although it's only available orally, but it's a safer thing to use. Then, of course, review. Nothing can be done until we actually review the patient, what was there and what is present now. So reviewing the patient, utmost important. So just to summarize this thing for you guys, it is underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed. So always screen for it, the prognosis does become a little more poor, especially if we are not able to find any particular cause to it. But yes, we still need to correct the correctable, focus a lot on drug treatment, a lot on non-drug treatment. And of course, drug treatment are available whenever required. Thank you so much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Megha, for your presentation. Thank you so
Thanks.
much. We will wait for a few minutes so that we can have some questions from the participants, and then we will have the case presentation. Any questions with respect to the diagnosis, management, assessment of delirium? As Meka was mentioning, it's very common scenario in palliative care, maybe due to the advanced stage of illness, or maybe due to the multiple medications that they are on. Many of the medications are prone to cause delirium in the setting, and it is very common to see terminal delirium when the patients are dying. And it is very, very distressing for the family, because the last memory that they have about the patient will be that patient will be talking nonsense, verbally abusing people. We have many cases of assaulting because they are delirious, and the family find it very, very difficult. So we had a doctor who never, so his daughter was with him, and who never used to use a bad word in his life, and the words that he was using during the terminal delirium was really shocking. And this daughter felt it. I mean, she was really upset about that, uh, yeah. And at some point of time, he was tied to the hospital bed, which was totally unacceptable for the patient and patient's family, because of the dignity with which they were living, and just because of delirium, he was tied onto the hospital cot. So all these have a great impact on the family, because they'll remember this forever. Any questions from you?
Dr. Asha, you have raised your hand.
Ma'am, have you have any question?
You can unmute yourself and say.
Okay, thank you. That was really nice, Dr. Meka. What I wanted to check with you was how terminal is terminal delirium? So are we talking about the last week, last month, last year of life? So when do you call it terminal delirium?
Yeah, so mostly, when we call it terminal delirium, it's usually imminent, when the patient is imminently dying, so say days. Days is mostly that we term it as terminal delirium. And yeah, I think, does that suffice?
Yes, yes. I think
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
During the last 1 or 2 days or few hours to
A few hours. Yes.
very short days, like 1 or 2 days. That will be the time. Yes, Dr. Vaidyanathan. Yes, sir.
Madam, that's a good presentation. Most of the time when we see delirium in ICU or in wards, we usually give quetiapine, which is most of the time, it's almost a favorite drug of choice along with haloperidol. Is there any contraindication to use quetiapine? Say, you want to say no drug? Yes, agreed. No drug will be the best modality. But sometimes they really are irritable, restless, pricking everything. The caregiver also, it may be really taxing. So is it okay to go ahead with give some quetiapine? Most of the time we
Quetiapine
Yes.
is a good drug and more or less a safe drug, just that it is only available orally. So the patient should be able to take it orally. That's the only thing. Otherwise, yes, I think quetiapine is a good drug. You can use it. There's no harm in going, but because non-drug therapies do not work immediately. And sometimes when there's hyperactive delirium, we do need to resort to drug treatments. It's a good drug. You must use it.
Yeah, I agree to that. And I think psychiatrists go up to 300, 400 milligram of quetiapine per day. So we have enough dose in our hands to manage, and it can induce a little bit of sleep also than haloperidol. So it works.
Yeah.
If the patient is able to take orally, then that would be the drug of choice. But if not, we may have to go for infusions of haloperidol. And one important thing is to so very often we see practices like starting a benzodiazepine when the patient is delirious. It can actually aggravate the delirium unless you give a base dose of antipsychotic, and then maybe you can add on a benzodiazepine to induce sleep or to calm them down. But benzodiazepines are not the first line drug for management of everywhere. Literally, you see in a usual setting when the patient is agitated or delirious, they start benzodiazepine, and it aggravates the actual situation. Yes, sir.
Yeah, madam. I want to add one more thing. Benzodiazepine is considered as one of the precipitating factors. In fact, we have seen delirium in patients who have been treated with benzodiazepine earlier. So benzodiazepine is a strict no in all elderly patients, hospitalized patients. If you use benzodiazepine, the chance of them going for delirium is very high. In fact, we say, in addition to all the things what madam has already sorted out, the day in, day, time, all those things, in addition to that, opioid first or analgesics first. So first we have to consider pain as a thing. give analgesic, never use benzodiazepine unless the patient is a chronic alcoholic who may be in alcohol withdrawal syndrome. There is only scenario where probably benzodiazepine is indicated. Otherwise, you use benzodiazepine, definitely they will go for delirium. There is a very high incidence, and it is one of the prescribing factors along with what Madam has already told. That's one addition, ma'am. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Very right. And it's a very common practice to give benzodiazepine and the patient ends up in a big mess then.
Benzodiazepines and also opioids. I've seen people starting fentanyl infusions for delirium, So yeah. So somebody's asking, Dr. Dipali is asking, do we need to stop amitriptyline if complaint of delirium is there? If yes, immediately or slowly over the period of time? So mostly for pain, when we use amitriptyline, most of the times we will not go above 25 or 50 milligram, right? So we may not immediately stop it. First, we need to see, we can decrease it, say if the patient is on 50. However, in our daily practice, we even do not go up to 50. It causes a lot of dryness of mouth and those things. So most majorly, if the patient is on 25, I might decrease it to 10 milligram practically. But first thing is to correct the electrolytes and other things and rule out any brain metastasis or those things. And we may not taper it down immediately, like after diagnosis. And then anything else, Dr. Dipali? Is your question answered? Yeah,
no, ma'am. No, thank you. Thank you so much for answer.
Okay. So another thing is uncorrected asthma and sleep deprivation can yes, of course, uncorrected asthma and sleep deprivation. Patients who have not slept well for days together, again, there are higher chances of going into delirium. Yes. Dr. Digambar said that. Thank you, Dr. Digambar.
Any other questions or comments from your side? And it's very important to recognize hypoactive delirium also, because untreated hypoactive delirium is very bound to cause terminal agitation. They become hyperactive on the course of illness. So we think that the patient is depressed most often. So we had a patient who was not even talking at all. Suddenly he stopped talking. And he was not responding, and we thought he's going to depression. And but I think when Dr. Raj came for rounds, he asked a few questions about the consciousness and alertness and the orientation, and then he was totally lost. We thought he's depressed. So with correction of underlying cause and with some medication, he could be back to normal. So it's very important to recognize hypoactive delirium. Hyperactive, we will definitely recognize because they run around or make a lot of noise. We have to do something, but hypoactive, we may overlook hypoactive delirium as depression. So it's very important to differentiate between all this. And I think towards dying, many of them see a lot of visual hallucinations, and it's very important to not to deny it. When I was talking to our psychiatrist, she was telling they actually see it. So when you say, oh no, there is nothing there, so they see cats and dogs walking around me, cockroaches crawling on me, someone is there sitting and talking to me. So then we don't tend to don't need to deny it. No, there is no one. So we tend to tell them, no, there is no one sitting there, there is no dog, you are inside home. So it's okay to leave it like that, but to understand what are the underlying causes for those kind of disorientation. Dr. Rakesh, does benzodiazepines warrant use? Megha, you want to comment during acute confusion state?
So even in acute confusional state, I feel the drug of choice would be psychotropics like haloperidol or quetiapine rather than using benzodiazepines.
Yes. And regarding the opioids, sometimes pain can be the reason for delirium. Sometimes opioids can be the reason for delirium. So it's very important to differentiate whether the patient is crying because of pain. So if the pain is the reason for delirium, if you decrease or stop morphine, you will understand the patient will be having terrible pain. So it's very important to differentiate whether it is due to the pain or it is due to the opioid. So history taking, understanding each and every part of the onset, the pain, everything is really, really important.
Yeah. And behavioral pain scales, of course, they come in really handy at this point, how is the patient lying down? What are the facial expressions like? So many times, yeah, of course, in delirium, again, we get confused, but still, I feel we use behavioral pain scales in such patients, and they do come in helpful to differentiate pain.
Yes.
Dr. Vaidyanathan has said benzodiazepines are contraindicated at 2%. It's analgesics first approach and then psychotropics. Good, thank you so much.
Yes, I think that's the same in palliative setting also, especially with terminal delirium. Benzodiazepines are contraindicated. And thank you for bringing it up again, because there is a tendency to use benzodiazepines when people are delirious.
Dr. Megha,
Yes.
can I have one more, ma'am? Yeah, thank you. Like, is there any other thing which we can do for hypoactive delirium? I know it is, we also say it is one of the poor prognostic indicators in our critical care practice. Is there anything other than correcting correctables which we can really do to help them to come out of the hypoactive delirium?
So I feel, yeah, non-drug treatments are really important. Talking to them and not letting them just be, many times they are hyperactive. The family also feels that, okay, they don't want to talk or they are just like that. So we kind of stop interacting with them. So still interacting with them and trying to know what exactly is bothering them. Sometimes there are a lot of things that are going in their head that are the cause of this hypoactive delirium. So talking it out, non-drug treatments and drug treatments. I think, yeah, that's.
Yeah, we can use drugs also the same way in hyperactive delirium also. Sometimes they do come back. They do get reoriented with the whole thing, but with milder doses.
Which one, ma'am? Which one do you suggest?
So
Quetiapine?
either quetiapine or haloperidol.
Yes.
Most of the time, what happens is, as I said, quetiapine will induce some amount of sleep.
Yeah, so it's
So
good
it's
for some patients
actually-
actually. When they don't have sleep, they might say sleep deprivation, then I would choose quetiapine. If they're already very sleepy all the time and hypoactive, then I would choose a smaller dose of haloperidol. So yeah, if they are already very sleepy, you can think of haloperidol. But quetiapine they
What's
prefer
your
because they
personal
don't
experience?
sleep at night. They will be very agitated or talking to themselves at night. So quetiapine can induce sleep also. So it helps that way. Sir, sorry, you were telling something.
What has been your experience with hypoactive delirium? How do you tend to treat them? Like,
Yes,
how
so
often you
I
get to see
think
and what do you do?
1 or 2 years back, I think 3 years back, we never used quetiapine. When we had a psychiatrist in our group, then only we got introduced to quetiapine. Till then, we were using haloperidol. But I have used haloperidol for hyperactive delirium, and with smaller doses, we didn't need to go for higher doses as in hyperactive. Usually, they respond to smaller doses of with the haloperidol. We start at 1.5 milligram or 1 milligram night dose, and then we'll reassess. Meanwhile, we'll be checking whether there is anything correctable, whether it is depression, are we missing depression, or is there anything that needs to be corrected, like hyponatremia specifically, because it tends to have hypoactive delirium than the hyper. So we keep, the important point is that we keep reviewing whether we are missing out something till we get an answer that, okay, it can be disease progression or it can be terminally dying situation. But till then, we keep checking all the parameters, not the big scans, but at the commonest things like constipation, urinary retention, the blood parameters, dehydration, pain. So all these correctable simple causes, we keep checking, rechecking again and again to check whether. So we have a multidisciplinary team meeting every morning. So then if you don't, if you miss something, then some other person will be pointing it out. Okay, did you check whether there is this thing? So yeah, that's how we work on it. We keep rechecking it. That's the key point there.
Drug therapy specifically, something like any pyridostigmine or some CNS stimulants, do you ever try? Or
I have not
you
used Megha.
think
You
more
have?
of treatment?
I have not used it myself, but we have given, when we give references to our psychiatrists, sometimes they have used some medications like I think Modalert or something. They use certain medications, but I have not personally prescribed them ever. They do, psychiatrists do use certain medications, some CNS stimulants, yes.
Yes, Dr. Rakesh. you were telling about sleep disorders due to anxiety, panic state after knowing the diagnosis. Yes, but that is totally different from when the delirium part. I think there you can you need to identify why they have the sleep disorder. Is it anxiety? Is it depression related sleep disorder, or is it some drug induced? So it's important to evaluate why the reason for insomnia, and definitely if it is due to anxiety, you can rely on benzodiazepines. Not for all insomnia, Dr. Anita. We have to. Insomnia is a huge topic. Plenty of reasons for insomnia. So we need to differentiate what is the reason for the sleeplessness. It can be due to pain also, or it can be due to anxiety. It can be due to depression. So it's very important to differentiate why this insomnia, and then we can. Confusion assessment measurement. Dr. Megha, you have any experience in
Yeah.
CAMSCO? I have not used.
No, we have not used it, but yes, this is another measure that is used for assessing delirium also. Yes, confusion. So there are 2-3 more objective tools for measuring and screening delirium. CAM is one of them. We can use it. Yes.
Thank you so much. We'll take up the case presentation, and then we'll continue the discussion after the case presentation.
Absolutely.
Dr. Sindhu.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Megha, for the great class. I'm Dr. Sindhu. I'm working as a volunteer at a palliative care center in Mysore run by SPVIM. I'm presenting a case of a 36-year-old male with hepatocellular carcinoma who underwent partial hepatectomy and has liver cirrhosis, ascites, esophageal varices, right hydrouretronephrosis, and bone metastasis. His presenting complaints were severe back pain for the past 1 month. He's unable to sit, stand, or move around since 1 month. He was diagnosed with hepatocellular carcinoma 4 years ago, for which partial hepatectomy was done and chemotherapy was given. For the past 4 months, he developed back pain, which was insidious in onset, progressive in nature, sharp shooting type of pain. The pain is present constantly, prohibiting the patient from any kind of movement. Pain reduces only when he lies flat on his back. Turning to any side or any kind of movement causes severe pain. His severity score was 10 on 10. He was also unable to pass urine for the past 2 days. He is able to pass stools. On general physical examination, he had pallor and icterus. Musculoskeletal examination showed straight leg raising test was positive, and active and passive range of movements of both the legs were restricted at the hip joint, but sensations were normal on bilateral limbs. On abdominal examination, partial hepatectomy scar was present. Abdomen was distended, and there was dullness to percussion starting from the umbilicus. He also had flapping tremors. Ultrasound showed chronic liver disease with portal hypertension and left renal calculi. Endoscopy showed esophageal varices. MRI of the spine revealed L3 vertebral body showing anterior wedge compression, suggestive of metastasis. He also had multiple collaterals in the spinal canal, causing compression of nerve roots at multiple levels. L4, L5 showed severe neural foramen stenosis. L5, S1 showed spinal canal stenosis, and there was also left growth hydrouretronephrosis. Psychosocial aspects. We have a 36-year-old married man with 1 daughter, used to work as a daily wage laborer and was the breadwinner of the family. Now his main source of income is from his siblings. He feels that he can fight this illness and he can go back to his routine. He believes a surgery can be done, which can cure his metastasis. The family is distressed because the patient thinks that they are not spending enough money on him, and that is why he is ill. He wants them to take loans and treat him somehow. And the wife is in tears saying she's very tired and unable to take care of the patient. Ascitic tap was done. We started him on paracetamol, tramadol, which did not really help. Then later, morphine was started, 10 mg Q4H, which relieved his pain slightly. We referred him to radiotherapy, but it was not done because of his restricted movements and ascites. Main concern is pain, mobility, and acceptance of his disease. To summarize, we have a 36-year-old man with hepatocellular carcinoma post-hepatectomy with bone metastasis, cirrhosis, portal hypertension, and esophageal varices. I would like to discuss how can we manage the pain, how do we increase the quality of his life with respect to mobility, and how to make the patient accept his illness, and what can we do for his life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sunil. I just want, I might have missed, so does he know about the prognosis really well? Or?
So later on, we did talk to him and then explained it to him. He still wanted to, he kept asking like, am I really going to die? Is this really, that's it. Like last time I had a cancer and they did a surgery and then I was fine. So now why can't you do a surgery? That was his question, which we explained to him later and he seemed to understand it.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sunil. Any other comments from the participants? What do you think about managing this patient? So I think the pain is controlled, right, with morphine later on.
It was okay, yeah. Actually, the patient deteriorated really fast. Within one day, the next day he became unconscious, and then he started bleeding, and we lost him after a few days.
That's probably because of the hepatic liver functions that were deteriorating a bit.
Yes.
Any comments from the participants before we ask Dr. Megha for her? Yeah, I understand the scenario might have changed. He's not no more, but yeah, at least for the next time, is there any learning points that you want to from the other participants? So how to any ideas on improving the quality of life with respect to mobility? It's a major concern for many patients when they become bedridden and have to be dependent on the family just to go to the toilet or to move or change their position. It becomes overwhelming for them that I don't want to be dependent. And sometimes they feel loss of role because they are taking care, they are kind of dominating all the activities in my life, which I don't want. So how to deal with such situations when you come across other participants? Anyone? You can either chat or you can unmute it.
Yes.
Yeah, one way might be to give some assistive devices if he's like, I think
he's
depends
unable
on,
to move from his bed now. He's like completely bedridden.
so yeah, so walker may not be the choice there. I think talking to such patients, it comes mostly with the denial or not accepting the fact that things are progressing and he might be bedridden for now on. So they might be really looking forward to getting this okay. Like previously they did a surgery and I became okay. Why can't you just do a surgery and make me okay, kind of thing? That's also very common. I think, yeah, Megha, over to you.
Yeah. So yes, so such patients, especially when there's no acceptance, are really difficult to manage. But however, here when we are managing pain, so now this patient deteriorated really fast, but such bony metastasis are really, difficult pains to manage. So as you already said, that the only position he was comfortable was lying down supine, right? When there was no movement. So I feel there are 2-3 things that we can do for his pain. First is giving realistic expectations, to hope to the patient that, look, the rest pain will be good, movement pain will be better, but we cannot really get away with that movement related pain. So we always try to, when we are giving the doses, we try to, the anticipated movements, usually we try to time them. Like if we give morphine at 6 a.m., so try to do your morning routines at around 6:45 or 7 when the effect of morphine is the best. So at that time would be the best for the patient to do his morning routine, say brushing his teeth, taking a bath, and those things, right? Since in this patient, there is also L3, which is where there is a compression fracture of L3, and there are multiple levels where the spinal canal is stenosed. So in that case, mobilization becomes really difficult. But if it is only the bony pain, and even in this, we also need to add some bisphosphonates to the management. But in this, if the liver functions are deranged, I am assuming might be that the renal functions are also deranged. So we can give something like RANKL inhibitors like denosumab would be appropriate for that will also help in bony strengthening and pain. So bisphosphonates or denosumab will be good. Then, of course, managing such patients with patient PCAs, patient-controlled analgesia really helps. They get to have that control that whenever they understand the concept of taking a rescue dose and then doing their daily course. Okay, so and as you rightly gave them, the spinal brace would be important to help them in mobilization if we intend to do that. But again, we need to explain them that if there's already a fracture, that there are always chances of developing paraplegia when we mobilize such patients. So we need to see if we are looking at a little longer term prognosis, then we might need to see the posterior cortex of the vertebra, and if we can do something for strengthening of any one particular bone, if that is the cause of pain, something like a kyphoplasty or vertebroplasty, if there's one bony metastasis that is really hampering the mobility. So we should always take care of our interventional pain experts or orthopedics experts to help us with kyphoplasty or vertebroplasty. So that will also help in managing pain. And of course, opioids, and then our step 1 drugs like paracetamol and NSAIDs. NSAIDs are really good, but in this case, there is already liver functions. So NSAIDs we will not be able to use NSAIDs, and we have to use lower doses of paracetamol too. So paracetamol, opioids, along with anti-neuropathic agents, something like gabapentin or pregabalin, along with amitriptyline, which is already used in this patient. So we need to titrate the analgesics up. Using a patient-controlled analgesia pump is a good option that we can use. And
I think we lost Dr. Megha.
I think we lost her because of connectivity issue. Please stay tuned. We'll be back soon.
Meanwhile, if you any other have some comments, please. So one thing we do for the family is the bereavement support, where we will be just making a call to the family after 3 weeks, or definitely after 2 to 3 weeks, and just see whether they are doing okay, whether they are coping well. Is there any kind of depression in life? Yeah, that's what we do once the patient passes away. But I think during the course of illness, when the disease is progressing, it's very important to give a separate session for the family members also, because it's the family also who's going through a lot of suffering at that time, seeing the patient in pain and a lot of questions that they cannot answer, and they really want someone to be there to open up all these questions. They'll have a lot of doubts. So what we do in our setting is that the social worker will be seeing the patient, and after the morning rounds, they will be sitting specifically with the family members, each one of them. There might be sessions with the wife, with the son or daughter together. If there is any confusion in understanding the prognosis, then there may be sessions together. so that they are kind of well prepared that what is going to happen. So if you are anticipating a hepatic encephalopathy, signs of hepatic encephalopathy that might set in. So we tell them patient might be more sleepy in coming days. He might be disoriented. He might end up having a bleeding. So all these preparation is very important in terms of taking care of the family, because they won't, they'll panic less because they know that this is happening. And if this is happening, whom to call, where to call, what to do. Do they need to bring to the hospital, or is it okay to keep it at home? So all these anticipatory symptoms to be talked about, and instructions how to deal with that when it happens. That's very important, because this is a case where you are expecting a sudden deterioration, and these kind of symptoms can set in. Kind of, we know that this is going to be either one of it is going, it is highly likely to happen in coming days. So it's very important to prepare the family with the anticipatory prescriptions and instructions whenever possible. Did
Thank you.
Dr. Meka could join? There might be some network issue. Yeah. Any other?
And also, these
yeah.
patients always tend to ask, how long do I have? How are we supposed to answer this question?
Any response from the participants? How long I'm going to? I'm not sure whether we touched that during Dr. Biju's second session, but yeah, I would like to hear from you. How would you answer that? It's a very common question. The moment you talk about the diagnosis, even if it is a curable cancer, the first question would be how long I have. So what can be the response? Any suggestions from others? How will you respond to that? I'm waiting for responses in the chat. So I think there is no response. I would start asking back, what made you ask the question? Why did you ask that? I will not say, okay, now I think you have 3 or 4 months. Definitely, I'll come back to that. Yeah, exactly, Dr. Meka. I don't usually quantify, but I'll ask them what made them ask that question. Why did you ask that? Can you tell me more about it? So then they might come up with, they understand that disease is progressing. I know that I was more active. Doctor told me that now it is chemotherapy has failed. So all this information will come up, but I won't definitely give a quantity of number of days and everything. Yes, Dr. Kamakshi, no, I've never come across that question yet. Yeah, but then, yeah. But when it comes to very serious illness, they might not laugh. Actually, they are actually waiting to plan their life or days ahead. So they might be thinking of, should I do some money? Should I make my wife go for work? What about my children's education? Yeah. So I'll ask the question back, and I'll understand what he's understanding about his own illness. And during the talk, it may come. So then I might see that I might tell him that the days are limited, the time is limited. This is how it usually progresses. And whenever you are giving the prognosis, it's given in a wide range, not like days to weeks or weeks to months kind of range, not exactly. I've heard people telling us, the oncologist told I have only 6 months. So they might be counting exactly that 6 months and like, see, it's almost the 5th month, or I have already gone through the 6 months. Now it's the 8th month. So yeah, so those kind of, we can give some range if they are insisting more, but I won't usually quantify the time. Yeah. I also tell them I can't predict, I can't tell them, but according to the experience or according to what I have seen, it might be anywhere from weeks to months. So when with the first question itself, they will tell that I want my daughter's marriage to happen before I die. Should I make it faster? That's why I asked that question. Then I might probably tell, yeah, it's a good idea if you can prepone that marriage. When were you planning to make it happen? If it is next year, then I would say, is it okay that you can postpone it to coming 2 to 3 months? Then it will be good, because this may be the right time that you are in your best time of health for the marriage and everything. So yeah, it is never quantifying the time. Thank you. Dr. Megha texted that she's trying to join, but due to some internet issues, I think that's okay.
I think she is already in the meeting, ma'am, but maybe
Okay.
she.
Can you hear us? There might be some. So if there are no other questions, maybe we can wind up today's session. I think we lost Megha. I'll thank her personally. She's here. Thank you so much for being with us for today's session. Thank you so much. And you all keep writing your assignments as soon as possible, because we are nearing towards the end of the course. Yeah. Yes, Dr. Digambar, that's a very good point. Irrespective of how much time you have ahead, it's important to convey that we are there to care for you. We'll keep you as comfortable as possible. That's a very important message to be passed on to the patients. Yeah. Thank you so much, Shri Priya.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Megha, for joining us if you are still available in the call. And thank you everyone for joining in. So that brings us to the end of this wonderful session. I believe we got some new information regarding the topic. So please don't forget to leave your feedbacks, because it is most valuable for us. We have shared the link in the chat box, and the same will be shared in WhatsApp group as well. So with that note, this is Sri Priya along with Dr. Sridevi Warrior signing off from the Tips Echo Desk. See you in the next session. Till then, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.